Welcome to the Proceedings podcast. I'm Bill Hamblett, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute. Today is Tuesday, the 6th of May, 2025. Good as always to have you on board, everyone. This episode is brought to you by the members of the Naval Institute. Since 1873, our members have been the foundation of the open forum of proceedings and everything else we do, from events and conferences to our award-winning press books to our USNI news team. If you're already a member, thank you. And if you're not, go to usni.org/join and become a member today. Start getting proceedings, start getting the new C-Scroll USNI News member-only newsletter, and awards and discounts and invitations to member-only events. Again, become a member, usni.org/join. Let's get to our guests. So first of all, May is International Navy's Month for Proceedings. Every year, we stack the May issue full of content from authors from our allies and partner nations around the world. My guests today are Commander Stefan Lundqvist, Royal Swedish Navy, and Julian Pavlak. They've written a terrific article in the May issue. It's called Managing Maritime Insecurity on NATO's Northern Flank. Stefan, Julian, welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir.
Many thanks.
All right. So before we get to the Q&A, just tell our listeners a little bit about yourselves. We'll start with Stefan.
Okay. I'm Commander Stefan Lquist from the Swedish Navy, active service officer, pro-dean at the university, and also an Arctic researcher. I did my PhD on maritime security in the Asia Pacific and in the Baltic Sea region, and looking upon, cooperation between US, Sweden, and US, Finland, and then partners with challenges with China and Russia in these two regions that small states have. So that is me.
What was or is your warfare specialty in the Swedish Navy?
I'm mine warfare.
Mine warfare. Okay, got it. All right, and Julian, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, Julian Pavlak. I'm a researcher with the German Armed Forces University in Hamburg, where I am leading our Maritime Security Research Network and all part of the German Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies. It's the quite new German Armed Forces think tank, which is about to make critical thinking, critical impulses for the armed forces, for the MOD, about certain topics, and in which mine is mainly the area of maritime strategy and security, and mainly the focal area of Europe's northern flank from the North Atlantic to the Baltic, and also increasingly the Arctic region. And this whole part is where my research in the recent years focused on, and in which framework I also had the opportunity to join Stefan's institution in 2023, for instance, the Swedish Defense University, as a visiting fellow, and continuing this work from here right now. Thank you.
Yeah, that's terrific. So we got a Swedish naval officer, a German academic, two different countries bordering the Baltic, sort of a north and south perspective. Lots happening, as we all know from watching the news the last couple of years, especially since the war in Ukraine has kicked off in the Baltic. A lot of security challenges there, and to Sweden, welcome to NATO, and to Finland as well. So there's been a lot happening on, as you put it, NATO's northern flank. So let's start. I'll ask Stefan to take this question. Just describe the current security situation in the Baltic. What is the threat? How's it evolving or changing? Why is the Baltic so important to the littoral nations of the Baltic Sea?
Okay, well, yes. The Baltic Sea is a very shallow water basin. It's fairly big, but the average depth is only 54 meters, and then we get some basins that are far deeper. A characteristic, it's 7 out of the 8. It's 8 NATO, EU, and member states. It's Denmark, Germany, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and Sweden, which are all NATO and EU member states. And then we got Russia. So Russia is kind of the outlier. And it's to get there, it's connected with the North Sea, then through the Kattegat, Öresund, the Great Belt, and Little Belt. So it's like a gateway to get in and out. And I think these characteristics are kind of key to address the need to secure it. And until Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, I would say the Baltic Sea was a sea of peace and cooperation. And when we talk about maritime security, we talk about maritime challenges like how do we do sea safety, how do we preserve the environmental aspects of this sea, and this is why we kind of contributed Navy and Coast Guard assets to promote maritime security in the EU-led military crisis management operation, even now for Atalanta, to send them off because there was no need for these assets to be inside the Baltic Sea. But since 2014, when we have been increasingly plagued by hostile Russian activities within the gray zone between peace and war. So what has happened then? In the last decade, we have had, including, a significant decrease in threats and activities that are adversarial to us. And in the last two years, we've seen a constant rise in downfall maritime accidents that result in disruption of power and communication, and that's through cables laid on the seafloor being cut. We've seen gas pipelines being blown up or dragged to collapse, and we have it's cost us quite an awful lot of money. So Russia's use of these kind of leanly manned and poorly maintained aging tankers and bulk freighters, they causing us a lot of problems if it's dragging these anchors and damaging our infrastructure. And we are very concerned now about the risk of huge oil spills in the environmentally sensitive Baltic Sea. We can't take one of these big accidents. So we got maritime sabotage crimes, and that is affecting these 8 coastal states in the region. And well, how is it changing? We find that we are deploying. I mean, Russia doesn't have a coast guard. We are deploying military assets, and we are deploying military assets, and that's one way. But these are essentially criminal maritime activities, and there is a need also for the policing aspect to get it right. I think we'll come back to that later. But it's been for the last decade, Russia harassing, all kind of civilian shipping activities and interfering with our maritime research and the laying of this infrastructure. So it's nothing new. I mean, we've been around all the time trying to disturb and do that. We also have these kind of incidents with jamming and spoofing of GPS signals. That's kind of regular for ships and aircraft in and over the southern Baltic Sea, and of course also in Northern Europe. So what we're thinking out of now is how NATO can deter Russia from engaging in hostile activities against our critical maritime infrastructure and employing in anti-access scenario denial capabilities, while we want to manage the risk of military escalation to keep that risk low. I think it's
Got it. So Baltic Sea, relatively shallow sea. It's difficult to access it, as you say. You have to go through the Danish Straits. 7 EU and NATO nations all are littoral to the Baltic, as is Russia. Russia, in order to get to St. Petersburg, you got to go through the Baltic, but also Kaliningrad, which is that separate, state of Russia that's sort of that borders. There's Poland and a little bit of Germany and a little bit of the Baltic states, right? And the headquarters of the Russian Baltic Sea Fleet. So you mentioned, Stefan, when you were talking there for a minute early on, you said that there's been undersea cables have been cut, and also there were attacks on, I think it was in late 2022 as the Ukraine war kicked off. There were attacks on undersea, the Nord Stream pipelines, the gas pipelines that come from Russia down into Germany. Did they ever find out who definitively attacked those gas pipelines?
No, we have no official perpetrator for that one. So it's actually 4 pipelines, and 3 of them were blown up, and one is still intact. And that's one that has been discussed in media these days now, is possible reactivation of that single line that is, possible to still reactivate.
Gotcha. How much trade roughly moves through the Baltic Sea?
It's quite significant. I mean, for Russia, the port of St. Petersburg is kind of key. It's deep into the Bay of Finland, and let's say 60% of Russia's maritime oil exports are being on keel through the Baltic Sea. That means some 10 to 12 million tons of crude oil monthly, and the number of tankers we're using is 90 to 100 tankers each month. I think that's what we're talking about. So what we also need to know, which links up the Baltic Sea region to the Arctic region, I would call it the regional security complex. You can't deal with security solely in the Baltic Sea because it's along NATO's northern flank. And most of these shipping from Russia is destined to China. And it's for bulk, it's for oil. And in many cases, these ships return with ballast. So much of the this export is one way. It's kind of a crowded sea. So we got, pleasant craft, we get some oil rigs. It's Polish and German in southeastern Baltic Sea. There are a lot of wind power plants, and it's also a very environmentally sensitive area. So there are very many interests that come into this. And on top of that, mine warfare, and I mean, there is a significant amount of mines still remaining on the seafloor after everything from the Crimean War. So it's First, Second World War. It was mining and countermining and that kind of thing. So it's if you're mine warfare, Baltic Sea is kind of it's a very interesting area.
Yeah, it's a place to learn your trade, right, and perfect it. Julian, over to you. How is the war in Ukraine affecting the security calculus among the Baltic nations?
It affected it very importantly, I would say, because you could observe several things. I think the first and foremost, it was very clear, maybe for the Baltic states or Baltic Sea nations, which were aware of it before, but for the NATO alliance, that Russia again or continues to use aggressive means to push their interests in its neighborhood and against sovereign states. So it was very clear confirmed that all their fears and preparations that have been said before, many years before already, not only since 2014, already since 2008 and the beginning of those incursions in Ukraine and Georgia. And this has been confirmed. So there was this has shown that the need for preparations to defend those countries, the Baltic states, Poland, but also Scandinavian countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, for any potential aggression in the region, that it's needed and it's timely. So there is this first sense, and it's also the sense to make it clear that there's more needed than the so-called tripwire forces, which have been used for a couple of years in the Baltic states, because you need to try to really deny the area to the enemy or to Russian forces for a potential incursion. So regarding the maritime domain, the denial capabilities are very important, but actually for both sides, also for the Russian forces, of course, because if you look at the security calculus or the military calculus, that would be also very unfavorable for the Russian Baltic fleet to operate in any kind of conflict in the Baltic region. So there's a change towards creating or investing into more denial capabilities, which you can already observe for almost all Baltic or at least Western Baltic states around, which are investing into mobile platforms, into more capabilities in this regard. And to also look forward about also the example of Ukraine, how it deals in this asymmetric way against the way bigger fleet in the Black Sea. What to perhaps learn from it. Of course, you can't use those examples one-to-one for the Baltic Sea because you have different circumstances, different conditions, but you can look at ways, at perhaps strategies for certain operations, how you could adapt them. But you have to also look out for the Russian possibility of adaptation, and also the Russian side is learning from this conflict. And if you look at the situation in the Baltics or in the Baltic Sea, it could be quite the other way around, that Russia as a outsider, as Stefan has said it before, could turn the table, if you would like say, and try this asymmetric approach with drones, with technologies against the Western states. So there's plenty of pointers to watch out in this regard.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance here. As Stefan, you said 60%, that struck me, 60% of Russian oil exports go through the Baltic from starting in the St. Petersburg area. So even though Russia has that enormous northern polar Arctic Sea coastline, I mean, thousands of kilometers of Arctic Sea coastline, there's really very few significant ports up on the Arctic Sea. So much of their exports has to come and go through the Baltic, at least for now. With that, and that makes it vulnerable, but it also heightens the interest of Moscow, of course, in the region and in the sea. How is NATO currently? I'll go back to Stefan. How is NATO currently postured to defend against the Russian threats, and where is NATO's capability strongest, and perhaps where is it in most need of strengthening?
As in general, I would say the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO strengthened NATO along its NATO flank, and the size of Russia's territorial waters and EEZs are very limited, and its port in the Bay of Gdansk and the Bay of Finland can easily be subjected to a naval blockade. And I would say its isolation in the Baltic Sea has worsened as NATO members have responded to its threats and military aggression. And we are strengthening the member states' capabilities in defense. But I would say what maybe we are not as strong is the national strategies that each of the member states have implemented in the aim of deterring when Russian threats and also possibly Chinese threats and hostile acts. And I would say NATO members in the Baltic Sea, I think we need to understand the objectives of Russia, the objectives of China, and actually identify any misalignments and capability limitations. And we need to coordinate and integrate our strategies to operate like in what we in Sweden call the total defense, or across all government agencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what we in the United States would call a DIME strategy: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, sort of integrating all aspects of government power.
So if I look to Finland, so for Finland is actually like a logistic island. In the old days, it had quite a lot of trade in eastern Finland with Russia, and that was after the Second World War, when Finland had to pay the war reparations for 5 years. Everything that was produced in Finland went to the Soviet Union.
Wow.
So the infrastructure of the tracks, the gauges is wider. So now Finland is taking measures. So they're planning now to have the European measures for the track gauges to be interoperable in the high north. So Finland is trying to diversify its logistics. We are also discussions on building a bridge up in the Bay of Bothnia between the city of Vaasa and Umeå. It's like let's say 2/3 up from the Åland Islands that divides the Baltic Sea into the Bay of Bothnia and then the proper Baltic Sea. What Russia has done more, and we might need to bear, they have reestablished the Leningrad military district, because formerly it was 2, and now it is 1. So Russia got a significant strength up in the Kola Peninsula in capabilities. And now the land forces have, of course, been reduced due to the war, but the naval assets and the submarines, the nuclear deterrent, it's fairly intact and it's growing. So the capabilities from a naval perspective is growing quite significantly up there. It's not doing like that in the Baltic Sea, and the Baltic Fleet is not growing like that. Rather, I mean, we have seen some downsizing because of they have been used in the Black Sea, consumed in the Black Sea. And that is something we need to bear in mind, that these small corvettes of the Baltic Fleet, you can use it on the rivers, so you can have this strategic shift. You can move them from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea without going through that. So that's why the size of their ships are quite limited. So Russia has a weakness, and now after Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania disconnected from the Brel grid, this is one of the reasons we saw all these cable cuttings. So when we laid the cable from Sweden to Lithuania, Russia was in disturbing it all the time and tried to disrupt the laying of these power cables and also the communication cables. But now it's Kaliningrad that is isolated. So for Russia to supply that logistically, you have these rail going in for the, let's say, the high speed things, but the rest is also going on keel from St. Petersburg down to Kaliningrad. So that is not a very strong position. So Russia is strong in the Arctic, but not that strong in the Baltic Sea region.
Yeah, fascinating. So you mentioned, and I served in Russia as the U.S. Naval Attaché about 20 years ago, and I remember. So I visited. I never got to Kaliningrad, but I went to Kronstadt, which is a naval base up in St. Petersburg. I also went to Murmansk and Severomorsk up on the Kola Peninsula. And in Moscow, there's quite. You mentioned the riverine system or the canal system that connects several of those fleets, right? So you can sail, as you said, small corvettes from the Baltic down to the Black Sea Fleet in what would look like to Americans a land route, right? But you don't have to go all the way out into the Atlantic and through the Mediterranean and that direction to get to the Black Sea Fleet. The Russians can maneuver within their riverine system from one fleet to the other. That's a great point that you make about the geography. But Kaliningrad, as you said, it sits out there as its own separate enclave, separated from the mainland of Russia, by the Baltic states, and so it's difficult for Russia to reinforce it logistically, militarily, etc. It sits out there sort of vulnerably.
So if I make a scenario, for years we have used the presence of the Baltic fleet. If you as long as the Baltic fleet is in port, we would not expect any immediate measures happening.
Yeah.
Because but if a Baltic fleet is out, sailing, because anything happening on land, you would have that fleet out. Because if we would Finland and Sweden could very well make sure that fleet units will never get out, because deep in the Bay of Finland, Estonia and Finland would take care of that, and we will help together and with our naval capabilities. So what happened, and these corvettes, because it's mainly small corvettes, and the fuel capacity of them, if we start chasing them around, they will not be operating for very long before they need to replenish.
Yeah.
And if we are out, how are we supposed to get in? We will have assets preventing them from getting back in. And that means that something will have to happen on land, because the ports that were operational during the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, was actually the ports that were in the Baltic states. So this is why it all comes together. And I would say the Baltic Sea region is essentially a multi-domain operations area in all respects. And that is why we can't see it like some Navy going in dominating that soul. It's a multi-domain area. So the distances are that limited, and the capacities and capabilities are that substantial, that it would be a very intense fight in all domains.
Yeah, that's a great point. Interesting. Back to Julian. Let's talk about a little bit, again, I just want to make it clearer to our listeners that the undersea and the seabed threats. So we already talked a little bit about the Nord Stream gas pipelines, and Stefan corrected me that there were 4 of those. 3 of them have been attacked, although no real smoking gun or definitive evidence was found of who did those attacks. And then we've heard reports in the last 6 months or so about Russian and Chinese commercial ships dragging anchor over some of those undersea communications cables. What's the thinking in NATO about how to defend against additional attacks like that against the undersea infrastructure that's in the Baltic Sea?
Yeah, a very important topic and very timely, as you just mentioned, especially in the recent 6 months, but also in the recent year, 2024 mainly, but also before those incidents, and the increasing amount of incidents raised the attention to those and also showed everybody involved, for the NATO nations, for the littoral nations, the vulnerability of those infrastructures, actually also how hard it is to actually defend them, because all those actually thousands of kilometers or sea miles of pipelines and data cables are very hard to defend. So it's not possible to position a frigate every 50 miles around to observe the areas of operation, obviously, and it's very hard, or even more hard, to observe or estimate the area below the surface, who's active there, what's going on below there. And it is from one perspective good that the attention raised for this topic, especially since 2022 and since the mentioned Nord Stream sabotage and the incidents, because this vulnerability and the amount of vulnerabilities around is now even more observable, not only for the experts, for the militaries or the academics, but also now for the public, for the politics. So it's very important that this topic has been raised, and now those issues are are dealt with. Because you have had from the military perspective, from the scientific perspective, already for years, for 10, 15 years, even longer in some direction, the warnings and observations that there are developments, particularly from the Russian side, in this seabed warfare area, in the undersea domain, specializations in this domain. So the awareness have been raised from certain sides, but you didn't have had the complete political attention to it, because the those mentioned incidents finally raised it. For the way ahead, how to deal with it, I think the first approaches which have been done are very good, like the starting of more and better communication, how to deal with certain incidents, to create a better cooperation of also navies, coast guards in this regard, how to deal with issues. Secondly, to increase also the presence, the domain awareness in those areas, on the one hand in bilateral ways, on the other also on the NATO sphere, particularly now with the Baltic Sentry mission, which is this multinational activity, not mission, in the Baltic Sea, to raise the maritime domain awareness, to raise the awareness what's going on the on the sea or below the sea, and also to deter further actions in this regard. But as we also raised in our article, this is an important step, an important activity to do so right now. But of course, it's not a solution for all the time, because it is from my perspective also an ad hoc way to now deal with the threat. But you need to develop certain capabilities also together with the littoral states in the Baltic Sea, particular, but also beyond, to create and install a really continued way of observing the situation in the Baltic Sea, to create really finally even a 24/7 approach of maritime domain awareness above the surface, and also continue to do so more and more around critical infrastructures which are underwater, below the surface. But this way to the latter is only possible if you create a further combined approach, not only with the different nations and allies and their navies, but also with their further security apparatus, their coast guards, their police, federal polices, for instance, but also the private sector, who's basically also responsible for the security of their installations and their cables. Because neither alone is capable to deal and observe with those threats. It's only a solution or a way forward to do it, really combine with the states, with the nation states, their institutions, and also the private sector.
Yeah, I heard maritime domain awareness a lot in your answer, and the need to combine the efforts of all the NATO and EU nations that border the Baltic, so that they're sharing that maritime domain awareness, right? So their coast guards and their navies are talking to each other and sharing data about the location of Russian or suspect vessels and what they might be doing, and also to share that information with the private sector. As you said, that the companies that install and run and maintain that undersea infrastructure, that requires agreements across nations, internationally, among a team of nations, across NATO, probably to some extent at the EU level. And then, when you bring in the police and the investigatory parts of governments, that's a lot to coordinate, right? That's a lot of talking, a lot of data sharing, a lot of agreements about what format the data has to be in. That's not an easy task, as you pointed out. We're running a little bit short on time. I just want to get to the last question. So your article ends by saying NATO needs a fully integrated strategy combining resilience and deterrence now more than ever. So I think we've already touched on this quite a bit, but Stefan, what are some, maybe 3 or 4 of the high-level things that requires?
So may I use this final time just to make a little extra thing here?
Of course.
So the Baltic Sea is very environmentally sensitive, and we get some really comprehensive, let's say, areas that are protected in the Helsinki Convention. So it's for marine environment, from all sources of pollution, the preservation of biological diversity, and the promotion of sustainable use of marine resources. So now entry and access to the Baltic Sea is through the Danish Straits and the North Sea. So this is why I think we should use the UNCLOS and the laws and these conventions to make sure that ships operating in this area, and now we got this black fleet of Russia that is all tankers, all container vessels, all bulk vessels that are poorly maintained, poorly crewed, and having false insurance certificates on board. And we are running around, and apparently we don't have control about their anchors and their maneuvers. So I think we should actually leverage that, let's say we call it legal warfare, and make sure that let them out, escort them out if you want to, so it's safe. But why not check that you have everything in order? Because to enter into the Danish Straits or like that, when we have these sensitive areas, make sure that from these legal environmentally preservation, we are checking that everything is in order, that the ships are safe to operate, and make sure that there are insurances, because if you break something, you have to pay for it. And that could be one step of deterrence, that we are not allowing this to happen. We are not allowing these bad ships to enter this very environmentally sensitive area. So we need to kind of operationalize that. And of course, then we need to follow up. So we need to have this situational awareness. We need to document what is happening and how things are operating. And if the Russians are unhappy about that, they don't have a coast guard. They will send their corvettes out and start messing around like the helicopter. We need to document that as well. And if we deploy and employ our coast guards jointly together in a well communicated and way of doing that, then of course if Russia start to intervene here with escalation, then the escalation is on their part, and that's why we need to stand together to have that integrated, let's say, way of working based on maritime law. And I think that is something I'm going to continue exploring with my colleagues and go forward on suggesting to our policymakers. But then, of course, having said that, part of NATO, Sweden are now deployed with a battalion in Latvia. We're going to take along forward land forces for NATO up in Finnish Lapland, and we are contributing to defending NATO territory now. So we should not, just doing that softer part of security. We should also do the high end and display that we are in this together and there is this unity. And thank you for allowing us into NATO from Sweden and Finland. I think a strong dimension here, we are allied with the United States, but also the Nordics and Baltics are now united in a political union and a military alliance, the strongest in the world. And let us, keep it that way, because we are stronger if we are standing together to these threats.
Oh, you're preaching to the choir. I'm a huge fan of, I mean, the world in the last 80 years since the end of World War II has been a safer place and has been more open to freedom and democracy and economic development for everyone around the world because of those alliances and partnerships. And so, I'm a big fan. And the only way to stop nations like Russia from continuing to bully their neighbors and others and from skirting international law is by banding together and showing that we are a strong team, and if you pick a fight with one of us, you pick a fight with all of us. I think that's really important. Well, we are out of time. This has been a great conversation. My guests today, Commander Stefan Lundqvist, Royal Swedish Navy, and Julian Pavlak from the German Defense University. Did I get that correctly?
Yeah, Armed Forces University, exactly.
Armed Forces University. Okay, thanks. And they've written a terrific article in the May issue of Proceedings called Managing Maritime Insecurity on NATO's Northern Flank. Stefan and Julian, thanks for being on the show and for writing for Proceedings.
Thank you, sir.
Many thanks.
Okay, save the date. Just a week from tomorrow, the Naval Institute's 152nd annual meeting will be held on 14 May in the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center in Annapolis. It's always a great event. This year, in addition to honoring our Authors of the Year and some essay contest winners, we will also be holding a panel discussion on shipbuilding with several of the authors from the February shipbuilding issue of Proceedings, and it'll be moderated by Sean Stackley, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition, and an acquisition professional himself. So 14 May, starting about 1600 in the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center at the Naval Institute, our annual meeting and our shipbuilding panel. Until next episode, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.